This episode is about the F words that seem to trigger a lot of people, either side of the ideological aisle. Feelings and facts. And when did we start letting the former usurp the latter? For more than a few, these words are rooted in our foundational values and cross streams more than we'd like to admit. Many hate to admit they were wrong, humble for forgiveness, when the error, if any, was in simply reacting out of emotion rather than acting objectively and free from bias. Pragmatism, the removal of emotion from the consideration process, is difficult for many to muster. In fact, if critical thinking and pragmatism were our first and final filters before forming opinions, I would imagine we'd see a much different world out there. What I argue in this podcast, in the content I create, in my books, is not wholly removing that emotion, but acknowledging the emotional response for what it is, setting it aside until your decision is made, then reapplying that emotional perspective to see how your decision is affected, if it should be affected, and if it warrants reconsideration. There, I've given you a whole self-help book in 60 seconds. This episode, thankfully, is about more than that. That's the lesson I'd like you to walk away with from all this. What this episode is about is the way our feelings have been manipulated over and over again so that we allow those to supersede the facts we weren't taught in our low-funded public education or our biased and misfunded private education. We were too busy working 2 jobs while trying to figure out how we were going to ever repay those student loans to dwell on it too much in college. So here's your crash course on a few events of our recent history that eroded the stable foundation of any civilization: empathy, knowledge, and understanding. The American working class has been a focus of this podcast, and it's at the center of this episode as well. The American electorate, every voter, and even the folks who abstain, minors, those who simply can't speak for themselves. This is about 2 radical factions of the right and left, and how they've engaged in this ideological and legislative tug of war, supposedly on behalf of the American workers, but from completely different perspectives. Those likely are cultural and intellectual, environmental and generational, maybe even genetic. What I'll argue is that one pivotal presidential candidate spoke to a segment of our population and shifted the social narrative in a way my generation hadn't seen before, and launched America, the working class, down a path of frustration, disillusionment, and resentment toward our establishments that has since boiled over exponentially. There were specific points in social division that laid the groundwork for the MAGA movement and the Trump era of corrupt, conservative politics. From Ross Perot to the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street, this episode is about how facts and feelings have been manipulated against us, how we're encouraged to selectively disconnect our empathy and compassion, but react with rage when someone triggers us. Just when did relying on facts stop making common sense? Did facts ever matter? Maybe not to people who've long been incapable of intellectually understanding them. Now, I'm not being mean, but you can sure bet economics and education play into this. I'm making some strong points about all of us in this episode. And for this, we must acknowledge the differences between facts and feelings. For this, let's be pragmatic. And welcome to the podcast. America has a tricky relationship with absurd and abhorrent wealth. We loved Elon Musk until we realized he's kind of a much more dangerous Thomas Edison meets Lex Luthor. We loved Taylor Swift for a while until she's dating a football player and jet sets around the world, breaking hearts and our ozone layer. We never really know who to hate week to week in America unless we get the newsletter. What most people can agree on is that, at very least, we're resentful of the wealthy. Call it jealousy, call it recognizing inequality, whatever you want to call it, that tricky relationship is that some want to eat the rich, literally and figuratively, and some want to be the rich so badly that it doesn't matter that they have no hope of ever getting close. Those who want to one day be the rich tend to lean much more sympathetic to the rich. They'll excuse tax breaks on the corporations, even though those perks are what closed the plant in their town and moved it to another country altogether. They vote for the wealthy politicians in their communities, even though those wealthy politicians don't represent the people. For some, public service is about the honor to serve the community. For others, public service is a path to stable employment, quality benefits, usually a pension, a retirement plan, influence. This is a Romulus and Remus story of America's two brothers, the better brother and the lesser brother, back at it. However, within this dynamic, the lesser brothers are divided into the lesser brothers who are tired of being the lesser brothers and recognize the better brother is only better because of advantages and privileges, and the other lesser brothers who see the better brother with hope that one day they will be the better brother, or that the better brother will pick them and lift them up to his level. That lesser brother would bend over backward to win the better brother's favor, while the other lesser brother would recognize that power dynamic's corruption, realizing the end result is the same. If they spoke out against the better brother or played along in hopes for the scraps, the better brother would never pick them to sit by his side. We have a disparity in America, economic, academic, every single area, especially with education. The plain and simple fact, feelings aside, is that there is a hierarchy of power dynamics in America. Systematically speaking, of course. White, straight, Christian, conservative, male. Now, you might cock your head to the side like a curious dog over some of those, but in most of America, the flyover states and the places that aren't cities, even in the blue states, these are your go-to identifiers for privilege. At very least, people will bend to your will and fears you might shoot them. Because despite mainstream media's efforts since at least the 80s to convince us the problem is racial or geographical, smart America knows the real threat to public safety is poverty, which transcends racial profiles and, of course, white, rural, conservative, Christian males. For everyone who isn't that in America, it's a tougher path to acceptance. This part of our story is set in the early 90s, during the George Herbert Walker Bush presidency, as he was preparing for his re-election campaign against a young, charming, charismatic Southerner, governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. This period is important because what happened to our political parties during this time contributed greatly to fostering the kind of social atmosphere that led to where we are today. For example, during this period and after, the right and left fringes' respective attempts to stand up for their faction's working classes' rights forced the hands of the powers that be to see the growing dissent of the people against capitalism run amok, even if these groups didn't entirely realize that that was the machine they were raging against. Reaganomics wasn't fully exposed as the pyramid scheme we know it to be today. That trickle-down economics hadn't had time to fully unleash its dreadful ripple effects. You see, national or global economics, it's a slower crawl than our personal paycheck-to-paycheck economics. The things that happen on a much bigger scale take time for the people to feel the full impact. Whereas, if a disaster strikes on the home front, we're stuck with the immediate and lasting ramifications hitting us all at once. By the time the first Bush presidency was coming towards a re-election, it was becoming clear that would be the only first Bush presidency. Americans were uncertain, unsure, and unstable. The Persian Gulf War, it didn't help, but it did boost our economy somewhat, as war tends to do. However, even those bigger scale ripple effects, those were credited to the Clinton term. During Clinton's presidency, the American economy seemed to flourish. It was kind of like squeezing the last little bit of toothpaste out of the tube. You know that big bit there that gathers there at the little cone-shaped part of the tip? Well, the wealthy 1%, Wall Street and mostly conservative politicians colluding with corporate America's top campaign donors, they were the ones folding that toothpaste tube ever so tightly, squeezing every last little bit of that polish of prosperity out of the tip, rolling and folding and squeezing and scraping across the edge of the sink for days and days, knowing that's the last of the toothpaste. Then, as Reaganomics squeezed that final goober of goo to the conical tip of the metaphorical toothpaste tube, Clintonomics was there to push its thumbs up on either side to drain every last drop of paste from that tube. We've kind of been shortchanging ourselves on the brush for a while, trying to make that paste last. And now here we are with more paste coming out than we need, but we can't put it back in. That would be savagery. So we just brush our frothy little mouths to spit. Sort of trapped by our own greed, a little bit it seems. By the second Bush presidency, we were scraping our toothbrush around the inside of the cap and tube tip to get any minty fresh relief from the hangover morning breath. It's almost like it was the roaring 90s and then the economic crash from 9/11 was as a result. Like the roaring 20s and the subsequent Great Depression. What goes up must come down. The issue is when the economy is up and the people feel that sweet relief, you better watch out what those power players are doing while our guard is down. For the Clinton regime, it was the Telecom Act of 1997, NAFTA, and other legislation that would prove to be of no help to the still struggling working class. Here we are, with the story of American capitalism, the better brother and the lesser brother. Corporate America runs on greed. It's essential to success. It's essential to capitalism. Well, capitalism defined success anyway. Financially speaking, in order for our system to work, we must have the poors. Someone has to be the poors. Capitalism demands sacrifice. Capitalism is greed. As we will discuss in a future episode, greed is a sin and sin demands sacrifice, usually of your own humanity. Ultimately, isn't that what we all want to ask? How could so many people sacrifice their own humanity, sell their souls for what? To win? To be what, right? This episode is about a few things, but at the core, it's about the devolution of willful ignorance to prideful ignorance. It used to be that people were willfully ignorant. They didn't know and didn't care to know or learn any different. They knew what they knew and that was enough for them. Today, we see that morphing into an arrogant ignorance that almost boasts of how ignorant it is. People so boldly standing on sand dunes of opinion, no solid ground whatsoever, and so willing to die on those hills, literally or figuratively. How did we get here? This period of the late 80s to early 90s was transformative because technology was booming and the American people had non-stop distraction from birth to death in the form of non-stop entertainment. All the while, the protections for the working class's prosperity were withering and being whittled away by wealthy power brokers and politicians who sought re-election. Establishment politics as usual. It's the American way. Every so often, we need a break from that. Someone who can transcend party politics and offer the working class hope. Now, that doesn't come often from party establishment from either side, and when it does, it's derided as populism or pandering. It's rarely celebrated as much other than re-election rhetoric. Rare is it that an actual politician comes out and speaks to the American people like the American people and talks to them like they are people. Most politicians give speeches and statements that are so coached and rehearsed, even if it's filled with good ideas, it falls on the deaf ears of the uneducated, exhausted, and oppressed. Every so often, someone comes along who recognizes a segment of our voters who is uneducated, exhausted, and oppressed, and seeks to exploit that for personal or political gain. What very few seek to do with that is help those uneducated to be educated, to help those exhausted find relief from their working conditions and lives, and to help those oppressed out of the shackles of the foundational and institutional exploitations. They don't seek to help because an educated people think for themselves and find the answers to the questions they might ask. Those answers don't always involve politicians. They don't seek to relieve the exhaustion because a people who have the luxury of relaxation and personal time might use that to realize how bad their conditions actually are. If you give people too much vacation, they begin to think they should get more vacation and maybe one day even be the boss. How dare they? And that oppression is just a sacrifice we must all endure to ensure capitalism reigns supreme. Because in America, we need a get-rich-quick scheme. We need to have the hope of inherited wealth. We need that carrot of the lottery dangling in front of us. If we work hard enough for it or long enough for it, we'll leave our kids with something. Because in America, the easiest path to success is the privileged path of inherited wealth. For that to happen, one must obtain wealth for another to inherit. Why would they want to prevent us from leaving behind some inherited wealth for our children? Because if everyone is privileged to inherit wealth, how are they special? In America, it's much more difficult to get on a path to obtaining wealth than it used to be. As soon as a path to obtaining wealth appears, lawyers and corporations seize that and make it a for-profit pathway to moderate paycheck-to-paycheck success. Today, you have a better chance of winning the lottery than writing a best-selling book, hosting a most listened-to podcast, getting discovered on social media, and making it, going viral. You're better served working that hard to get on a reality television show than putting in the actual work to be successful at whatever it is you're wanting to do. There is a club, folks, and we aren't invited to it. But sometimes someone in that club will emerge speaking truth to power, putting the establishment in check, and reminding everyone that outsiders to the political establishment still have the power to upend the system. I mean, if they have the money. In the early 90s, one such political outsider did just that. And in doing so, ignited a movement that set forth socio-political seismic shifts in our country that would eventually breed two separate movements that were instrumental in fostering the kind of cultural atmosphere for a Christo-fascist cult of personality to rise to power and bring about the kind of events we see today, from the racial equality protests, the insurrection, Nazi and white Christo-fascist anti-drag protests of recent years. No, they aren't the same. But the fervent dissolution of our social fabric and democracy are at the foundation of all of them. The neoliberalism of Bill Clinton's presidential run would bring about a centering of left-leaning politics that would leave middle America and that huge chunk of independent voters resting on the center-right ideologically, while on paper boasting a center-left ideology in name only. They got to support a Democrat and thus not feel like total sellouts, but that Democrat's policies weren't always left. That lean to the right had been in place for some time, though. I've discussed before the obstructionism of Republican politics. Obstructionism, the philosophy and strategy of staunchly opposing anything presented by the opposition in an effort to stall their progress, unwind their efforts, and create an appearance of inaction or ineptness to the public. The point of obstructionism in this political sense is to make it look like the other side can't get anything done, then run your party's candidate on the platform of highlighting how little your opponent got done. The American people are simple-minded and preoccupied with debt. We don't have the luxury of caring whose fault it is. It doesn't matter to most of the people saying, "Look, they didn't keep their promises," are the ones who kept those promises from being fulfilled. And it doesn't matter if those promises would have benefited them and if they are the ones who kept that good from happening. Nixon. We have to go back to Richard Nixon for this. I know it shouldn't always go back to Nixon and Reagan, but Reagan was easier to swallow because Nixon was so bitter. What conservatives saw after Nixon was that a big chunk of their party would have supported Nixon for a third term, despite Watergate. Many were pissed that he resigned, so it's easy to draw the line of conclusion that many in America just wanted to win at any cost and didn't feel like silly things like elections, the Constitution, or ethics were important. Those people continued to vote and have children and infect those children with the cancer of bias, prejudice, and faulty logic. Since we're on the topic of Republican cancers of bias, prejudice, and faulty logic, we must discuss Republican strategist, political consultant, Reagan and Bush campaign advisor, and former chairman of the Republican National Committee, Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater rose to prominence in the 1970s in his home state of South Carolina, working on the campaign for known white supremacist Strom Thurmond, as well as Governor Carroll Campbell, a very, very white man who is credited with making the state so prominent in politics, what with key primaries every election cycle held there, influencing many races and campaigns. Lee Atwater's work was mostly behind the scenes. He might not be someone you've heard of, but chances are you've heard of the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy was the Republican Party's deliberate efforts to appeal to white Southerners for votes by stoking and igniting racial tensions and catering to their Jim Crow mentalities. This strategy was developed after many in the Republican Party were disenfranchised by Eisenhower's middle-of-the-road style of cooperating with the political minority in Washington at the time. That was the Democrats. Barry Goldwater's Republican faction, what would become the Dixiecrats and eventually MAGA, felt after about 20 years of Democrat rule in Washington, Republicans should have struck hard and fast for revenge. Eisenhower didn't want to play those kinds of politics. Republicans, in no mood to settle back into losing, as they had for most of the 20th century up to that point, identified the loudest and proudest of our society. Not necessarily the cream of the intellectual crop, but still a passionate set of voters angry about a lot of things, but really not smart enough to know what, why, or whom to blame. Those uneducated, exhausted, and oppressed, mostly white people in the South. Remember in previous episodes, I've talked about privileged oppression, that phenomenon where people have the advantage but still perceive themselves at a disadvantage, usually because the shifting winds of fairness. Well, see, Jim Crow laws being lifted as those winds of change into fairness they disagreed with, fervently. It was Barry Goldwater and others who stood tall to speak to those people using that Southern strategy. It was men like Nixon and glorified Grand Wizard George C. Wallace and later Trump who used that to invigorate a base of voters who require a scapegoat to blame for all their problems. A base of voters that almost need a scapegoat to look and be different than them. Well, by this standard, white Southern voters were oppressed by their government who dared to stand up and say, "No, you're wrong. People of color are people." And the monsters all said, and cried themselves into another Klan rally. By the standard of the exploitation of the working class, these white Southern voters were exhausted, but too uneducated to know that it was Republicans mostly who dismantled their unions and the protections in our system. White supremacist Lee Atwater, born in 1951, didn't invent the Southern strategy, which was really pushed to prominence when Atwater was a child, but he certainly embraced it later in his professional life. He likely embraced it in South Carolina in the 1950s, where he was from. Atwater's white supremacy and privilege was all he knew. It was the standard and the norm for the South, but especially South Carolina back then. Even into the 1960s, that state and those around it throughout the Southeast were evolving much slower than the rest of the country, socially, politically, in every imaginable way. Things are much slower in the South, especially a lot of the people. Lee Atwater's influence over South Carolina politics and then later our national politics is immeasurable. However, what if Lee Atwater had grown up somewhere where sociopathy wasn't the normalized standard? South Carolina, a very, very racist state, much like most of the American Southeast, wasn't going to foster much more than racism in a man like Atwater. Atwater would carry those attitudes throughout his political career. This Southern strategy is a large reason for the communities of color to abandon the Republican Party. Republicans didn't just focus on white Southern and rural voters, they turned their back on any American who wasn't. They appealed to the worst of us, rather than crafting policies for the most of us. While the name Lee Atwater probably doesn't mean much to you, you probably know Paul Manafort and Roger Stone as two people very close to the Donald Trump presidency. A photo of Atwater, Manafort, and Stone headlines a 2021 New Yorker article by Jane Mayer, author of Dark Money. That photo from their time at the lobbying firm Black, Manafort, and Stone, that article explored some of Atwater's private papers that shed a lot more light on the kind of man he was and the kind of ideas he had about other people. I've always thought about running for office as a bunch of bullshit, he said. Being in office is even more bullshit. It's bullshit. I'm proud of the fact that I understand how much BS it is. Mayer quotes from those Atwater papers. She lays out Atwater's claims of his high school years as being the class clown, striving to be funny, ultimately to screw everybody up, his words, even if it meant bullying and often abusing classmates. Atwater seemed to delight in chaos, the chaos at the expense of others. He was often a leader of disruption in school, and Mayer writes Atwood always understood his boundaries and the thin line of prank and punishment. She quotes his number one lesson of chaos as being, quote, so subtle they can't nab you for anything. It's how you should be. I can relate to that. And my personally being able to relate to that, along with my years of dedication to mental health, tell me that he suffered from a mental illness and a personality disorder that put his own enjoyment over the comfort of others. Just a little something I've worked out. What that does, though, is dehumanize others, even in the sense that you just aren't thinking at all about how your actions might affect them. You're so focused on doing the thing or saying the thing you want for your own satisfaction, whatever it might be, that whomever is caught up in the wake of that wreckage simply does not matter to you. Narcissistic qualities, at very least. Atwater's clear disdain for the business of politics, paired with his privilege and his racist, toxic white Southern culture, and his mental illness-driven need to be an agent of chaos at any cost, led us to an understanding about the man who shifted political discourse to everything's about race. You've heard that deflection, surely, from people on the right, that the left makes everything about race. Well, Lee Atwater did that. Atwater's legacy is changing the tone of political messaging to a more aggressive, bully rhetoric steeped in racism. While the Southern strategy shifted the Republican Party further right in the 50s and 60s, it was Atwater's strategies that shifted the party down the path of the alt-right. Lee Atwater, according to the New Yorker article, likened himself to the character of Eddie Haskell from Leave It to Beaver, the friend of older brother Wally who would pick on, tease, and bully Beaver behind everyone's backs. But as soon as June, the mom, walked in the room, Eddie was bright smiles and polite demeanor. Isn't that the Republican Party? Here's the confounding part of it all. Through all my digging on Lee Atwater, one thing was clear. He enjoyed the diversity he exploited. Roger Stone in the New Yorker article was quoted as saying Atwater believed in nothing and was an opportunist. Roger Stone said this. Roger Stone said he believed Lee Atwater had sold his soul to the devil. But while Atwater pushed a racist, white nationalist, conservative, Christo-fascist agenda, he did so while playing both sides of the moral, ethical, political, and social aisles. He was a musician who played for Percy Sledge and released an album the year before he died with the likes of Isaac Hayes and Sam Moore. He ran some of the most disgusting and despicable campaigns in modern political history, pandering to the lowest intellectual and social common denominators: white, Southern, rural racists. Yet he seemed to have at least working relationships with civil rights leaders like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. Isn't that the Republican Party? Shake your hand and stab you right in the gut. Atwater's rise to prominence was brief. He died in 1991 from a brain tumor at the age of 40, which was about 20 years too late, if we're going to be honest. I know that sounds insensitive, but Atwater was not a good person. He was a worse American. According to Mayer and other sources, toward the last few months of his life, when the end was in sight, Atwater expressed regret for his ways, urging Washington insiders and politicians to govern by the golden rule. You'll excuse me if that doesn't matter to me. Exploiting people for your own success and enjoyment and then realizing you were wrong only when you can no longer enjoy it is nothing to celebrate. Plus, those closest to him scoffed at that, saying his turnabout was farcical, noting how he was the same as he always was, even to the painful bitter end. The sad truth is, with that kind of personality disorder, even if he had survived the brain tumor, there's a high likelihood that his humility wouldn't have been permanent. Men like that tend to hold on to their pride and ego at all costs. They rarely come out of things like even cancer thinking, "Whoa, that was close. I need to reevaluate everything." Maybe the only way he would see the error of his ways was to know he was dying and know he had no time left to undo the damage he had done. The damage he had done still hasn't been undone. That influence is felt today, largely by those conspirators of Atwater's like Roger Stone, Charles Black, Paul Manafort, and of course, Donald Trump. And the countless white supremacists in this country that fell for that Southern strategy rhetoric again. Republicans. They'll put on the clever charade, the smarmy smile, and panders to the parents while they drag the children down behind mom and dad's backs, just like Eddie Haskell, a bully in Letterman's clothing. So maybe it's something that he did at least acknowledge how bad he had been. It just doesn't change the influence he wielded on American politics. His influence was greater than his remorse. His racism echoed throughout history, while his regret limited to the whisper of a memoir that would never see the light of day. Maybe that's the lesson of Lee Atwater. Wokeism. Lee ran rampant for his whole life, doing whatever he pleased, learning from getting caught, figuring out the life hacks to cause the most chaos and get in the least amount of trouble for it. Then at the end, he realized what a waste it all was. He could have used all that influence for something good. Lee Atwater might have died of brain cancer, but I'll argue the cancer was in his brain long before. The cancer of dehumanization, exploitation, and blind ambition. That cancerous competition culture of winning at whatever the cost. Now, this episode isn't about Lee Atwater, though. This is about feelings over facts and how America chucked the inconvenient truth out the window for our feelings. In trying to trace the timeline of when that happened, I think it's fair to say that Goldwater to Dixiecrats to Nixon to Atwater is a great beginning to understanding how we got to a place where, when every answer you could ever want is right here in front of your face, right in your front pocket, we'd still rather not know so we can just have our feelings-laced opinions on things we couldn't begin to understand. However, men like Atwater, Manafort, Stone, etc. influence ideas in this country among voters that become larger shared ideals and then become proposed policies, then legislation, the law of the land. That's the influence they leave behind. The fact that behind Atwater there was seemingly no greater moral or ethical code, or even a long-term game plan for the greater good, only a series of chaos actions for the sole purpose of just winning, makes one wonder, why? A question that plagued Atwater toward the end, but not soon enough. I argue that was his cancer. That is what killed him. Atwater's influence began in the 1970s as the counter-assault on women's reproductive rights was being organized and continued through the period where the NRA was infiltrated by alt-right extremists. Atwater's influence was amping up the Southern strategy as an aide under Reagan and influential in his 1984 re-election campaign as political director and deputy director. From there, he took his unscrupulous reputation for ruthlessness and joined up with Black, Manafort, and Stone. Incidentally, the lobbying firm Black, Manafort, and Stone's first client, Donald J. Trump. Other clients included world dictators, big tobacco, and various surprise Russian interests. Oh yeah, and Rupert Murdoch. In 1988, Reagan's vice president, Bush I, recruited Atwater to manage his presidential campaign against Michael Dukakis. In that campaign, Atwater's strategy was lies, misinformation, and smears. It was during this campaign that Atwater grew a close friendship to Bush's namesake son, W. They worked very closely together. When Bush I won that election, Atwater was named chairman of the Republican National Committee. One of his first actions was orchestrating the ousting of Democratic Speaker of the House Jim Wright in 1989, who resigned under controversy after one of his aides, a nepotism hire, was discovered to have committed a terrible violent act against a woman, convicted and sentenced only to be released after a much shorter period, then given a job at the Capitol as a clerk, then rising up the ranks to become the Speaker's chief legislative strategist. Not only that, there were ethics charges regarding what many might say wouldn't be out of the ordinary for Washington elite, but sort of opened the door for the kind of bipartisan war we've been fighting for decades and the level of animosity across the aisles we see today. You investigated our guy, now we're investigating your guy. Sound familiar? Who levied the charges against Speaker Wright? One of the framers of Republican obstructionism during this period. None other than Newt Gingrich. It's probably for the best Atwater died young. Like I said, had he lived, he certainly would have continued his work as RNC chair, where he began a smear campaign against Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Atwater recognized the upstart governor as a potential re-election spoiler and wanted to nip that in the bud. Had Atwater been part of Bush's campaign, it's highly likely that 1992 race could have turned out differently. Regardless of when or how he died, the influence of Lee Atwater lives on today. In all the worst ways. Which brings us to the 1992 presidential election. We've talked about the eventual neoliberalism of Clintonian politics and the historic stoking of the racial fears of the Southern strategy, but 1992 was an election that changed the face of American politics. On the Republican side, you had echoes of Nixonian politics with the dirty, unscrupulous tactics, misinformation, fear-mongering. Bush wasn't Reagan, but he was still a Republican. The other side was Slick Willie, Bill Clinton, whose own meteoric political rise was riddled with controversy, rumors, and scandal. Fortunately for Clinton, Lee Atwater didn't make it to that campaign for Bush. We can't blame the Bush loss on that, though. Like him or loathe him, H. Ross Perot was sort of, say, more recently a Michael Bloomberg, for example. He was the snooty silver spooner set on spending enough to spoil an election. Perot's silver spoon was that of a different kind of billionaire, sure. I know, hear me out. A very wealthy man nonetheless, and one who was able to garner a coalition of America's melting pot, stoking the populism movement against establishment politics at a time when American establishment politics was being exposed for the world to see on a 24/7 cable news cycle like never before. Spoilers. Just like always, establishment politics won out and sold out the American working class. But we're talking about the 90s, folks, where the social narrative of this nation became nuanced and neoliberalism normalized. What happened was a shift in our elections. Independent runs were nothing new to our self-proclaimed two-party system. But since then, no candidate has built a base of voters that strong. Not since Ross Perot. More spoilers? Bill Clinton dominated that 1992 election, winning by nearly 6 million popular votes and over 200 more electoral votes. Ross Perot failed to get a single electoral vote, but took almost 20 million votes away from both candidates, the most of any independent candidate in history, and the best independent showing since white supremacist Dixiecrat American independent candidate George C. Wallace in 1968, who got just over 9.5 million votes. Teddy Roosevelt, for comparison's sake, brought in just over 4 million in 1912 as the first progressive candidate, coming in second against Taft and winner Woodrow Wilson. In 1992, Clinton took nearly 45 million votes, Bush just over 39 million votes, and billionaire Ross Perot out of nowhere bought 19,742,267 American votes. We know how that ended, and I'll discuss more of the specifics in his campaign in just a moment. But just for the numbers' sake, Perot's campaign the next cycle, 1996, dropped to just over 8 million votes. While Clinton picked up 2.5 million votes, Republican Bob Dole didn't move the needle at all from Bush. Before we move on to independents in future elections, remember that figure. Almost 11.5 million votes Perot lost between 92 and 96, most of those presumably to Clinton's 2.5 million pickup. So 9 million unaccounted for voters who showed up to support Ross Perot but stayed home 4 years later. We'll also look into the why of that in a moment. 4 years later, in 2000, Ralph Nader of the Green Party took nearly 3 million votes in a crucial election where the popular vote went to Al Gore by over 500,000, but the Electoral College went to the Supreme Court and Jeb Bush, well, we know how that ended. By 2004, that independent representation dwindled to nothing, and again in 2008 until 2012 when Libertarian Gary Johnson won over 1,275,000 votes. Again, we'll get to that in a moment, because that led to 2016's shit show debacle where Gary Johnson's vote totals rose to nearly 4.5 million votes, Green Party candidate Jill Stein picked up almost 1.5 million, and independent Evan McMullin walked away with nearly 750,000 votes. I know. You've probably heard Jill Stein spoil the 2016 election for Hillary Clinton, and here's Gary Johnson and Evan McMullin's nearly 6.5 million votes hanging out there just getting away with murder, and nobody's batting an eye. Still, even without Johnson and McMullin, Stein's protest votes or true support, without all that, Hillary won the popular vote by a mandate of nearly 3 million votes. But Donald Trump's Southern strategy on meth boosted the Electoral College win for Republicans, and of course, that is where we ended up. 1992 to 2012, 2 decades of American history where only 2 presidential candidates went unchallenged from outside the two-party establishment. Since 2012, every election has had independent representation. It's hard to argue Perot didn't change American politics. Ross Perot's influence on American politics lives on today. Many elections have seen independent runs, though none consistent or as strong as Perot's in recent years. None as strong since Perot in 1992, of course, and all trying desperately to ignite the spark that brought out that many voters. Why? What did Perot have that those other candidates didn't have? According to economist Robert Reich, in 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was president, a Gallup poll showed 72% of Americans trusted the government and our established institutions to do the right thing most or all of the time. As of right before 2020, that number was fewer than 20%. Post-COVID insurrection and Trump charges, indictments, guilty charges, judgments, where's that number today? A Gallup poll released in 2023 showed around 32% of Americans trust Congress, while between 40 and 45% trust the federal government or executive branch of the government. When it comes to confidence in the institution of the presidency, Gallup's historical analysis shows in February of 1991 that favorability was 72%. However, 8 months later in October of that year, it dropped to 50%. In fact, since then, That figure's only been above 50% 5 times in 32 years, and that's including the 3-year consecutive period between 2001 and 2004. But we really can't count that because that was post 9/11 nationalism and before many discovered the truth about Bush and Cheney's war crimes, the 2 pointless, meaningless wars, and the misguided attempt to exact revenge on those terrorists who attacked us. It's just to say that in every question, there's an external bias for the answer. Every year, Gallup asks this question. There are many factors, unmentioned factors, that dictate how high or low these approval figures are. The last time that number was above 50%, a whopping 51, was in 2009, the first year of Obama's presidency, which immediately dipped into the 30s, and that's where it remained since, or lower into the 20s in some cases. Statistics can be manipulated to form any number of narratives, but the narrative I want to explore is Gallup's figures between February 1991 and October 1991, a loss of 21% in 8 months. This speaks to the disillusionment, disenfranchisement, distrust, and disdain Americans were starting to feel for their government. Those feelings, when unaddressed, can fester into something more dangerous than SNL sketches and anti-establishment rhetoric. When fuel is added to that fire, imagine the combustive reaction. In the early 90s, that fuel was cable television. The internet wasn't a thing commercially the way we know it today. It was easier back then to fall down those rabbit holes. Today, every answer you could ever want to any question you could ever ask is a simple Google away. Back then, well, because fact-checking often included a library. Let's explore what America was going through back then. It was social, political, and global turmoil. In fact, in January of 1991, America first deployed troops to Iraq for Operation Desert Storm. For the next week, close to 600 oil fields in that country would be set ablaze. Within 5 weeks, President George Bush, the first of his name, would declare victory and order over 500,000 troops home as soon as possible. In and out, just long enough to destabilize an already unstable region. Then, in March of 1991, America saw those unstable regions plain as day on domestic soil as Los Angeles police were caught on video beating the living daylight out of a man named Rodney King. That violent footage was on every media outlet for months over the next year. Further igniting racial tensions, in May, Washington, D.C. area police shot a handcuffed Salvadorian man, which sparked a backlash from the community where hundreds of people, young people, clashed with local law enforcement. Worldwide, the headlines were tense, and nationally, racial tensions would flare as would major stories centered around crime. Also, during that 8-month period, America's 24-hour nonstop news cycle was booming. Jeffrey Dahmer's fridge got raided. South America's apartheid was dismantled. Big oil was under scrutiny, along with environmental concerns, as Exxon forked out $1 billion due to the Valdez disaster. Super Nintendo and Nirvana's Nevermind were released, both sparking respective cultural shifts for young people. AIDS was still in the news, and later that year, as Magic Johnson admits to being HIV positive a few weeks later, Queen lead singer Freddie Mercury died the day after announcing he had AIDS. Also late in 1991, Jeffrey Epstein co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell's father was found dead of mysterious causes. Geopolitically, relating to events of recent history, an attempted coup in Russia failed, but the Soviet Union dissolved as Ukraine and others were recognized as independent sovereign nations. Oh, and in 1991, the first ever website is created. The internet was not really the internet by the time H. Ross Perot threw his Keebler hat in the presidential ring. Imagine if Ross Perot ran today amidst our age of algorithm manipulation and misinformation overload, where the For You feed was for sale to the highest bidder. Still, Ross Perot managed to see what Gallup saw in their polling. Americans weren't very happy with foreign instability, and our interference in the Middle East and domestic issues dominated the news cycle. Perot was a military man, Navy to be specific. His life was dedicated to Veterans Affairs and more specifically the Vietnam POW issue. Perot as a businessman was touted by Fortune magazine in 1968 as the fastest, richest Texan. It was very tough, though. His businesses ran with an influence on his time in the armed forces. Perot was the general and all swore loyalty to his supreme rule. As a strategist, Perot wasn't one to just wait and see. Perot saw what needed to be done and took action then and there, in all aspects of his life. This isn't praise, just a point. In crucial points of Perot's life, his impulsiveness and ego drowned out the voices of his inner circle of advisors. Perot's style wasn't always seeing the bigger picture, per se. Some things might have been better handled with kid gloves, but Perot's style was heavier-handed, like a drill sergeant. The man's legacy of calling audibles despite the consequences runs deep, from sending a private militia group into Iran to rescue 2 of his employees who were held hostage as prisoners, to his vocal criticisms of the Reagan administration regarding how very little Republicans did for veterans and POWs, as well as the Iran-Contra scandal. Ross Perot was getting fed up and saw something needed to happen. When Reagan's successor, the first Bush, sent troops to Kuwait, then Iraq, Perot was in staunch opposition of that action. Americans have always had very complicated relationships with our nation's warmongering. The people grow tired of constant warring and were in no hurry for a repeat of the disgraceful failure that was Vietnam. We'd have to wait for the second Bush for that embarrassment. Perot had an issue to champion and an audience ripe for the picking. An audience that was overwhelmed with one major headline scandal and crisis after another. Throughout 1991, Ross Perot made several appearances on Larry King Live on CNN. It was there he was asked about running for office, and Perot said no. Unless the people demanded it. And demand it they did. Perot's team got to work organizing and appearing on major network and syndicated programs to get his message across. Ross Perot, the billionaire, wouldn't accept more than $5 as donations from the people, insisting he would fund his own campaign. The people finally had something different on the political buffet, something different to choose from. Perot's rhetoric was fiery and populist to the core. He called out his rivals and didn't hold back. Pardon the now tired phrase, but he said what many Americans were thinking. 19 million Americans, to be precise. And it's fair to say some Bush and Clinton voters, too. Those who might have liked Perot's style or ideas or didn't like one or the other, didn't think he had a chance to win, so they voted safe, towing the party line. Imagine if the internet was then what it is now. Clinton would have been exposed as a corrupt backroom dealer and sex offender we know him as today. Bush would have been wholly unappealing to the masses thanks to his record and the stank of Reaganomics. Perot would have ridden that algorithm train to the White House with ease. It's fair to speculate. If nothing more, he would have bought the algorithm train. Perot wasn't a party politician. His campaign was filled with staffers from Carter's and Reagan's campaigns, and administrations too. His was a campaign for the people. Well, okay, not all the people. Our feelings over having a candidate speaking bluntly and openly about the issues our country was facing usurped the fact that the man was a homophobe. I mean, maybe he wasn't, but he refused to hire homosexuals for his would-be administration. Kinda seems homophobic to me. And that coming from a Navy man? The hypocrisy. America at one point seemed to like Perot more than the other two guys, but it was his appeal to Middle America, the heartland, and the flyover states, the disregarded and disrespected Southerners, those who had seen their opportunities dwindle and their prosperity squandered by greed, war, and taxes. Oh my! Bush and his taxes. Our feelings of finally having a no-nonsense candidate to clap back in the debates overshadowed the fact that Perot simply talked a really good game with these almost vague and generic ideas that appealed to a populace used to professional wrestling promos or post-game sideline interviews. Big, bombastic statements, whiz-bang personality, and lots of fire. But ideas? Concrete ideas? A plan? It was becoming clear by the summer of 1992 that Ross Perot might have the money to buy an election, but he didn't have the political stamina to actually be an elected official. His Bulweristic military style, my way or the highway, sworn oaths of loyalty-driven way of running a company did not work for a presidential campaign. Perot wasn't free of scandal, and those facts did make it more difficult for him to hold on to that valuable election cycle momentum. In July, reports surfaced that he had used his vast fortune and resources to privately investigate the Bush family in the late 1980s. Facts notwithstanding, the feelings of so many Americans felt too much like the humiliation and shame of Watergate less than 2 decades prior. Politics as usual, even from a Washington outsider. After that, turmoil, conflict, and clashes within his staff and with his staff against Perot. His arrogance and bloviating personality often sucked the air out of the room and left very little oxygen for his advisors. Whatever good those were, he wouldn't listen to them. Perot was a billionaire, and he got very wealthy very quickly, all on his own. While he achieved great success in his post-Navy life, it didn't come with much of the hard work many others exhibited to find barely a fraction of that success. Imagine that resentment and jealousy by the elite and the Washington power players. In July of 1992, Perot, under the crushing weight of negative press, poll numbers plummeting, and having spent $12 million on the campaign, his $12 million, he suspended his campaign on the very platform he announced, Larry King Live. Some speculated it was a ruse, a strategy, but it wasn't. Perot's ego was bigger than his bank account. Those close to him intimated that he wanted to be president so long as everyone loved him. The moment people started seeing him for what he was, he couldn't handle it, and he didn't want to run anymore. Between then and September, his team released the economic plan America had been waiting to see. This sparked some interest with many Americans and was cause for some debate. Perot insisted to be out of the race, but would endorse whichever Bush or Clinton would stand behind his economic policy. While he might have disenfranchised some of his supporters by dropping out, for show or for real, he had enough support nationwide for all 50 states to get him on the ballot. By October, Perot would announce he was back in the race. The press had turned on him by now, his antics on full narcissistic display. However, he spoke to the American people like they deserved to be informed. He would buy time on television to host these informative presentations with statistics, facts, charts. He would point out what was wrong with our system. He would challenge the decades-old American narrative of communism being the big bad enemy to the truth that corporate greed and our economy was going to be the next great war. He spoke real talk that the American people needed to hear, demanding accountability, responsibility, and an end to the bickering and infighting between our political establishments. Americans could rally behind that message. Except they didn't. What Donald Trump learned from Perot was how to rally. Perot didn't see the political campaign landscape for what it was. He stayed close to home, flew out for debates, a few rallies here and there, but for the most part, he wasn't a candidate that was out among the people. Whether it hurt his campaign, you can debate. It certainly didn't help his campaign. Perot was one of those candidates where the more you got of him, the less you felt like he was the guy. For a lot of people anyway. But his brash, no-holds-barred rhetoric in the debates was enough that many Americans at very least appreciated the breath of fresh air. However, as the election drew to a close, Perot spent several million dollars in campaign ads and TV time. Why did his economic plan take so long to come out? Why did he drop out and get back in? How was he going to enact that economic plan? Why did he drop out and get back in? Americans wanted to know, and he was there with answers. It's just that the answers were haughty allegations and accusations that the Bush campaign was secretly wiretapping his campaign when the CIA trying to insert operatives into his inner circle. When the American people caught wind of how he actually ran a business, like a fascist authoritarian regime demanding loyalty oaths and for employees to look at their jobs as a duty, well, that was something a lot of Americans just couldn't get behind. For 19 million Americans, their feelings mattered more than the fact that Perot had some serious issues. By the end, $60 million didn't buy H. Ross Perot the election. Hell, $60 million couldn't even buy one electoral vote. What it did buy was a sledgehammer. It cracked a facade in the American politics, and now the American people could see some light peeking out. Our political arena was forever altered. The political rhetoric and tactics shifted, normalizing less formal styles of debate and opening the doors of corruption for the American people to see on full display. Whether the Watergatean wiretapping allegations of the Perot camp against the Bush administration were true or not, the American people began to see that Washington hadn't changed all that much since Nixon. Worse than that, America began to see that the closest we came to thwarting the corruption and the collusion train in politics was a half-cocked billionaire with a penchant for authoritarianism. Perot's $60 million investment would be good enough to secure a significant percentage of the popular vote, enough to guarantee matching federal political funds in the next election. After his failed 1992 run, Perot started the political action group United We Stand, which would serve as a watchdog organization to serve as the political machine on which his next campaign would run. Populism was becoming popular again, and many Americans felt inspired for an independent party, a third party, to combat the corruption of career politics in Washington. By 1995, United We Stand was morphing into the Reform Party, which branded itself as a centrist political party. Perot was never able to maintain his momentum from the early part of the 1992 race, and even his strong finish with 19% of the vote in that election wasn't tangible. By 1996, he lost 10 million voters, and America was happy riding the Clinton train for another term. After Perot, Pat Buchanan would take the mantle for the 2000 election, and Wikipedia cites former wrestler and Minnesota Governor Jesse the Body Ventura as a reformer when he won the state's high office. The far-right white evangelical nationalist Buchanan didn't pan out as a candidate, obviously. Also in that 2000 election, another Reform Party candidate would follow in Ross Perot's footsteps to announce his interest in the presidency on CNN's Larry King Live: New York real estate mogul Donald Trump. Trump's first foray into national politics was one of ego even back then. The wealthy play these dick-measuring games of whose bank account is bigger, whose influence is greatest. Most notably, it was Ventura who convinced Trump to jump into the race. It's safe to say Ventura saw Trump's inability to filter himself as a similarity to Perot that would get the media talking. Buchanan ended up with the party's nomination that year. In that 2000 election, which deserves its own episode to itself, Ralph Nader would lead the Green Party ticket as the spoiler of the 2000 election that brought Perot's nemesis' son into the White House thanks to said son's brother and the Supreme Court. 4 years later, Nader would be the candidate on the Reform ticket. That would be the end of the Reform Party. They would not be able to amass enough support after that 1996 election to matter much after that. Trump, however, went on to plot his eventual coronation, taunting the media every so often that he might run. In fact, Trump almost ran against Obama in 2012, but threw his support behind Stormin' Mormon Mitt Romney, opting to hold out one more election. It's safe to say that Perot's campaign in 1996 turned out to be completely and comparably insignificant to 1992. However, Perot's influence brought about the seismic shift in our socio-political culture we see today, thanks to two separate movements by two similar yet separate factions on far polar opposite sides of the political ideological spectrum. The 15 years that followed Perot's final campaign would see his influence on we the people loud and clear. As facts became an inconvenient truth, feelings reigned supreme, furthering the divide between us. The United States of America, indeed. Perot's base was largely working-class Americans, blue-collar workers, and the core of America's voter base. His appeal was probably 60-40 right to left. Perot had issues with marginalized communities thanks to his daft privilege and problematic views of other human beings. According to Roper, who polled how different groups voted in 1992, Perot's base was more men than women, more white than anything else, but Latino and Asian a close second. He was not popular among the black community, who were largely supporting Bill Clinton. Perot's base spanned the age brackets pretty evenly, however, broken down into young and old with the divider at 50 years old, 65% of his support were younger voters. He appealed to income brackets pretty evenly, despite being abhorrently wealthy. His support was 13% Democrat, 17% Republican, and 30% of the independent vote. Though moderates loved him most, his appeal to liberals and conservatives was split pretty evenly. What's fascinating is that 14% of open LGBTQ voters stood with the homophobic Perot, while just as many stood with Bush. Surprisingly, as much as his life's work was dedicated for fighting for them, veterans supported Clinton and more than Bush, and supported Perot half as much as Clinton. Labeling his supporters is difficult. Much more difficult than labeling Trump supporters today. Perot appealed to many Americans from all walks of life because he called out the many issues most Americans complained about, but he had very little voice to criticize at the polls. With candidates decided for us, what good does that do? Well, $60 million is what Perot spent to prove the establishment wrong, and he still failed. Even his short-term success of getting on the ballot in all 50 states and getting federal funding fell short within 2 election cycles. By 2000, America's politics were decided by a single governor and a Supreme Court. By the time America was getting very angry about that, the World Trade Center had fallen, and nobody could criticize America or its president ever again. America had sold its soul to nationalism. What the 2000 election did was create more activists, people who just couldn't sit by silent any longer while our political system was bought and paid for, while we, the people, and our rights auctioned off to the highest bidder. Donald Trump's 2000 effort was exploratory, to say the least. It was dipping his foot in the waters. After all, Bill Clinton's scandal showed Trump that America would still stand behind a predatory sex offender, while he already knew America would stand behind a treasonous, know-nothing, know-it-all in Reagan, and he already knew America would stand behind the out and open corruption, collusion, and criminal acts of Nixon. Donald Trump only needed a roadmap to presidential victory. For that, he would turn to the loser, H. Ross Perot. But that's the end of the story. That's where we all ended up. Answering how we got there as a people requires us to explore the things we've discussed here, how greed and the 7 deadly sins are intertwined in our political and economic system, how capitalism at its core is oppressive, exploitive, and demands sacrifice, the sacrifice of poverty, opportunity, hope, and human life. How America's politicians have pushed our boundaries of normalized abnormality so far that we allowed the host of a reality show to become president only for him to auction off his cabinet appointments to the highest donors. How the American working class has sold out their values, surrendering to the competition cult of winning at all costs. Here we are, back to Lee Atwater, the Southern strategy, and dirty Nixonian politics. Add to that the overindulgent deregulation and nonstop stimuli of the 80s and 90s, from cable news networks dictating our narratives, opinions, and attitudes, to our entertainment media dictating our personalities and social skills. Then H. Ross Perot to jackhammer the foundations of our politics. In the theme of feelings over facts, we, the people, should have been able to see the writing on the walls very clearly. Especially after all this, in the age of the internet, where we can literally find out anything we want about anything we want. Harsh rhetoric and misinformation, Bulwarian my way or the highway mentality mixed with Lee Atwater's win at all cost attitude shifted the way politics worked from behind closed doors and shifted America's tolerance boundaries out just a little bit further, while thrusting the Republican Party further right. H. Ross Perot changed the way politics worked on display for we the people, but also gave permission for we the people to think outside the political box. My argument is Donald Trump wouldn't have happened had it not been for the moral and ethical decline of the party that would host him and the outlandish and brash, unpredictable candidacy of H. Ross Perot. And two other events that moved those political boundaries out even further dividing the American voter base than ever before. Well, almost ever. I've talked about the Koch brothers and other wealthy elite billionaires you've probably never heard of and their influence on American politics. This is one of those examples. 1992 saw Bill Clinton win. Ross Perot exposed the Bush family for what they were. Perot exposed Washington for what it was, and ignite a firestorm that could potentially grow to crush American conservatism. Plus, along with Clinton came his supermajority. Conservatives, Republicans, were on the ropes. The Clinton era was met with obstruction by Newt Gingrich and the Republicans, vowing to oppose anything he did and promising to bring him down. Eventually, Clinton brought himself down, which lowered America's bar and standards. Bush comes in and doesn't impress many but party loyals. Two pointless, meaningless wars and a crashed economy later, Obama comes in to clean up the mess. America rode the hope and change bandwagon for a few years, but in 2012, Obama faced opposition from Mitt Romney. Remember, this was the election the grandfather of birtherism, Donald Trump, threatened to jump in. The year after Obama was first elected, in 2009, the Koch brothers, big tobacco, big oil, and big just about everything, joined forces for a Legion of Doom. But behind Trump Luthor's birtherism propaganda and capitalizing on the populist appeal Ross Perot left behind, the Tea Party movement was started to disrupt and dismantle Washington. This movement stood in opposition to Obama's apparent progressivism and sought to push for a more fiscally conservative government than we had seen in quite some time. The Tea Party was the champion of the small government movement in America that sought to dismantle the power of the federal government. Anti-federalists and Confederates at it again. The Republican Party had been slowly driven further and further right since Goldwater in the 1950s and 60s. Since the Southern strategy rhetoric was fully embraced and normalized into dog whistles and passive-aggressive ideas that were racist but didn't sound as racist, the 70s, 80s, and 90s was a silent powder keg of racial and social tensions. While race wasn't a major factor in the 1980 election with Reagan, it's mostly because international turmoil and economic concerns were at the forefront. Racist Ronald Reagan didn't have to play the race card in that election. He could wait to drop the dog whistle crime legislation like Nixon did. The evolution of the internet into a commercially viable product everyone had at home and now in their pockets allowed for that base, the uneducated, disenfranchised, left-out blue-collar working-class base, to be ripe for the picking. What the Kochs and those elite power players knew after Perot was that Americans could be won over by an outsider, but it benefited them for that outsider to be within one of the major parties. They knew that an outsider on the left was usually a pro-labor progressive, so they fought to corrupt and dismantle Washington by corrupting and rebuilding the right, by rebirthing the Republican Party. Taxed enough already. The Tea Party movement, was about hearkening back to America's colonial classics, the revolutionary roots of opposition to authority. This is the movement that shifted the representation of the Gadsden flag and other historical flags, and even our American flag. The Tea Party would hold these rallies like H. Ross Perot didn't throw, that might have swung an election if the man was taught the value of hard work rather than getting rich quick. These rallies would be places where like-minded, frustrated, and angry Americans could gather and gripe, celebrate their own patriotism, whiteness, and privilege, strain those triceps, patting themselves on the backs. Many of these goobers would come to the rallies in colonial-era costumes. Like, a lot of these people were whackers, y'all. The Tea Party was an anti-Obama strategy, plain and simple. White supremacists and influential power players so strongly opposed Obama's popularity and melanin launched this organization, this organized effort to thwart his efforts as president and undo any progress he would make. By 2016, the Tea Party was no more. It wasn't needed any longer. They had done their job. Those who had left the Republican Party because one reason or another since Reagan left office flocked right back to the Republican Party once the Republican Party acquiesced to the extremist whims. By 2016, American conservatives, Republicans, libertarians, and moderates who didn't know no better were groomed, indoctrinated, primed, and ready to vote for Donald Trump. What the Tea Party was the unity of alt-right conservatism, far-right conservatism, right-wing populism, and the libertarian movements. What the Tea Party wasn't was bipartisan or open to all. The Tea Party didn't move the needle with a candidate in a national election, but their activism and hard work, along with financial backing of big oil, big tobacco, and the Kochs, as outlined in a Time magazine article by Jeff Nesbitt titled The Secret Origins of the Tea Party, was enough to clinch the House of Representatives in the 2010 election and stall much of the progress Barack Obama promised. After that 2010 election, the tides of the American working class were shifting right, away from union representation and toward a full selling out of all our rights as consumers and citizens to authoritarian elitism. It didn't seem to matter who the president was. Americans were seeing obstructionism at its worst. Just like with Clinton, just like with Carter, progressives and those even further left feeling disenfranchised by Obama's unkept promises, regardless of why he couldn't keep them, fed up with the issues of income inequality, corporate greed, and legislation like the Citizens United ruling left many Americans feeling similar ways as those Tea Partiers and Perot supporters felt. Over the summer of 2011, protesters and activists started speaking out and standing up for the American working class. Billionaire Warren Buffett issued an editorial against the wealthy, while Robert Reich, former Clinton cabinet member, exposed American capitalism for the scam it is. Over that summer, many leftists, liberals, progressives, and Democrats were standing up and marching. On the first day of the Occupy Wall Street protest, September 17, 2011, close to 1,000 people gathered at Zuccotti Park, which wasn't the organizers' first choice. Authorities descended on other locations the groups discussed. More and more media outlets began covering these protests, with more and more people seeing more and more people standing up to corporate greed. Those protests, the official Occupy movement, lasted 59 days and ended with Mayor Bloomberg ordered Zuccotti Park cleared on November 15th. While President Obama voiced support for the 99%, little was done in the way of actually supporting those who protested or the Americans those people protested on behalf. In the end, lots of police violence and arrests and a movement shut down without even being heard. What this did was inflame an already glowing ember of resentment from a leftist faction of our nation. Hardcore liberals, progressives, democratic socialists, actual socialists, communists. Remember, America's political landscape once looked much different and has seen the bullying and decimation of anything that isn't the two-party system. In fact, one might look at the Occupy movement as the last dying gasp of the American working class. It was this movement that rallied behind candidates like Bernie Sanders at first, while the Tea Party coalesced under Donald Trump in 2016. And all those establishment Democrats who just wanted everything to go back to the way it was under her husband got behind Hillary Clinton. Unfortunately, what happened then was the Tea Partiers became the MAGA movement. And, well, the left does what the left does. The left stayed home and pouted. When Bernie Sanders got the shaft by the DNC so they could prop up the favor bank Hillary Clinton, many lefties grew even more disenfranchised. Many voted independent. Many more abstained. Many abstain from the process every election cycle because they get too caught up in their feelings to recognize the fact that our system is a two-party system of selecting the lesser of two evils every election, and that the American working class won't have representation until someone from the American working class is the one doing the representing. What H. Ross Perot did was capitalize on a movement started decades prior to radicalize the American working class against their own rights and better interests. This Southern strategy, along with the radicalization of organizations like the NRA and the loosening of regulations across the board, brought forth the socio-political atmosphere where a man who said he wanted to have sex with his own daughter could win enough votes to become, well, to tilt the Electoral College and become president. Because my personal feelings about Hillary and the Clintons aside, the facts remain that of those two, she was the lesser of evils. She would have made a better president, and she did win the election of the people, a popular vote mandate. I just argue that the DNC really had gotten behind Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump would have led a failed campaign in 2016 and probably wouldn't have had a chance at a comeback in 2020. But those are my feelings, folks. And the fact is that this period of time, from Perot to Trump, radicalized those on the right and the left to discard facts and evidence and to climb those hills of opinion armed with nothing but emotions and platitudes, bullet points, insults, cliches, and clever marketing slogans. We, the people, lost. Because if a man so deplorable, with a support base so rotted to the core, can learn from the mistakes of our past, why can't someone good learn from the same past to unite the American working class? When will the American working class get a popular enough populist candidate speaking for the people, speaking to the people frankly and authentically, with the courage to do what is necessary and the experience, gravitas, and authority to cut through the red tape of Washington, while still being one of we the people? Drain the swamp was one of Trump's 2020 campaign slogans. What they didn't tell you is they just wanted to drain the swamp of the Washington scum and then reinstall a pro-business, pro-corporate, authoritarian, fascist regime. Which kind of sounds like what our previous episode was about, the one before, right? Doesn't it? I guess the Wall Street putsch or the bankers' coup wasn't as failed as history tells it. Turns out, just like the January 6th insurrection, the effort in the 1930s to overthrow FDR was just the tester to see what they could get away with, so they wouldn't fail a second time. It just took them 85 years to finally get it right. Coming up, a 3-part series called Fairy Tales and Fever Dreams, where I'm launching a full frontal attack on our mythology, fairy tales, little white lies, and bizarrely hypocritical customs surrounding some of our biggest cultural events. You know, as parents, we instill the lessons we were taught and then what we learned after to our children. Some of that can be pretty traumatic for all parties involved. In the next few episodes, I'm going to be discussing everything from Satan to Santa, our morals, our holidays, our customs, traditions, and the warped ways we continue to warp future generations. Deconstructing often comes with spoiling some of what you've come to rely on. I'm asking, why do we come to rely on these things? This might be sort of an expansion on what I started in Cracking the Commandment Code, where I deconstructed the cultism of Christopher Columbus, sort of looking into Columbus Day and why we celebrate it, and some of our other holidays too. Well, I'm digging a little deeper into this one, peeling back the perspective on some problematic ideas promoted by our culture. Why are some of our most recognized holidays, specifically the religious ones, more inclusive of pagan traditions than of those specific religions they're built around? Why are we, the people, so quick to chuck our values out the window the minute something sparkly catches our eyes or we're offered a day off from work? Lots to unpack and deconstruct over the next few episodes, and I hope you can handle it as I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, the Compassion and Critical Thinking Workbook, it's on Amazon right now. It's available for you to get there, and you can link to it through my website at joshbrandonmedia.com. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find everything from my TikToks, my original music, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting and voiceover work. It's all organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out some of my merch at my merch store and get your Trigger Tees and the Sir Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. I have more products coming soon. My latest book, Influence, is also on Amazon, and it's for anyone who wants to be on social media, be a social media personality, or grow what you've already got. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Make sure you comment on the video. Do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. And if you like this series, hey, consider a donation to Cash App. This is my job. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. Again, joshbrandonmedia.com. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.